Now, hopefully you're still following along with this course. As I said in the last section, feel free to stop this and watch a video again if you find yourself confused by some of the cloud concepts. People say I tend to go through things fast, but I feel that I've designed this course to the right level of detail. In this video, we're going to go into specific core products that Azure offers. We'll talk about virtual machines, virtual networks, storage, and all that fun stuff. It's a lot, I know. But thank you so much for being here. So at this point, we're going to talk about the resources that you can. These are the core ones that you can create. Now, there's a category of resources called compute. There are many different kinds of compute resources. We talked briefly about virtual machines in the past, but I'm going to be more specific again. So the virtual machine compute model, that's infrastructure as a service, allows you to have control of a Windows or a Linux machine within Azure. The reason why it's called a virtual machine is because Microsoft has software called a hypervisor that runs on top of their machines, and it makes you feel like you have control of an entire machine. But what in actual fact, it's a machine that's been divided among you and other customers. So it's not a real physical machine that you have complete control of. It is basically a virtual machine. The next type of compute is called a scale set. And so if you have, we talked about availability and how you need to have duplicate versions of things. If you've got multiple virtual machines, you might want to consider putting them into a scale set. This gives you that elasticity in terms of being able to add and subtract virtual machines from that set if you need to accommodate for higher traffic or lower traffic. Scale sets also have their own load balancer, their own availability groups built into them, their own load balancer. So essentially, it allows you to have multiple virtual machines acting as if they're one and increases the availability, scalability, elasticity of your application. The Azure App Service is another type of compute, but that is the platform as a service model. Basically, you're going to package up your code. You're going to go into your development tool, which might be Visual Studio, but doesn't have to be. Create your application, hit the publish button. That's going to create a zip file containing your application as well as your app config or web config files, which contain the configuration elements. And then that's going to get uploaded into Azure, and Azure is going to be able to run that as a web service just based on that. You don't have to provision virtual machines. You don't have to manage the scaling to that degree. You can have app services. You can create multiple instances. And again, load balancing would be provided for you. And, if the service was to fail, it would automatically heal itself, etc. Azure Functions, sometimes called the serverless model, which means that with an Azure function and a consumption configuration, you absolutely have no control over what servers are running. And even with functions, you can actually code your applications within the browser. So you don't even need a development tool, although you could use one. But Microsoft provides you an editor, a tester, a test harness even within that. Functions are small. They're meant to perform small pieces of work. If you set that up with the consumption model, then you get 1 million executions for free. And so it's a lot cheaper model. But obviously, the farther away you go from virtual machines, it is almost a new paradigm in terms of the development style. Now let's round out this compute section talking about containers. Now, almost every type of compute service within Azure has containerized versions. There are containerized app services, the Service Fabric has containers, and Microsoft has some container-specific services such as Azure Container Instances and Azure Kubernetes Services. Now, if you're not familiar with them, containers are a fairly modern type of deployment style for code. So you take your code, you package it up, you take everything that code needs to run into a single container, and then you can deploy that container to your testing environment, to your staging environment, and eventually to your production environment without having to recompile the code or make significant changes or do a lot of manual work to deploy. I can go back many years in my career to where deployments used to take hours. We would shut the system down at 1 a.m., start the deployment process, and by 8 a.m. bring it back online. And that was a 4 or 6 hour deployment process for some applications. With containers, everything that you need comes along with the code, and you don't need to do any manual configurations. You just deploy the container. Now, Azure Container Instances are what Microsoft claims is the quickest way to get a container created. You can typically create a container in under a minute. And so you're going to be able to deploy your code from your desktop into a code repository such as Docker Hub or Azure Container Registry and get that into a container running within an Azure Container Instance in under a minute. And so it's a very quick way to get code running in the cloud. Now, the thing about container instances is they don't have a lot of built-in scaling capabilities. You can have a 2 or 4 CPU server running your container, but then you can't just grow that into a massive application. It's not designed to be elastic or to scale. It doesn't have any of those features, but it's quick. The Azure Kubernetes service is a container service, but it does have those abilities to be elastic, to scale up, and to scale down. Kubernetes service is based on the Google technology for containers called Kubernetes, and it's become an industry standard. If you were to create your applications on your development environment, package them up, you can then deploy them into the Kubernetes service of Azure, into Google's own Kubernetes service, or even into an AWS server or your own hosted environment. So it is very flexible cross-platform technology. The next type of core service that we'll talk about are the networking services. Now, within your own data center, within your own environments, when you get a computer, you need to hook that computer up to a network in order to basically use it for anything. And so you plug it into your virtual network, you assign it an IP address, perhaps you get a domain name for it or some type of friendly name to access that server. And basically, it's the networking that allows computers to talk to each other. So within Azure, the virtual machines are connected via virtual networks. This is done entirely by software, so you are not actually talking about routers and network hubs as you would in your own environment, but it is virtually those things. A load balancer is a network device that distributes traffic according to some algorithm between multiple servers. So if you have multiple virtual machines and you want each of them, let's say you have 2 of them, and you want them to split the traffic 50-50, you're going to need to put a load balancer in front of that in order for traffic to be evenly divided. So that is a load balancer device. Now, a VPN is called a virtual private network. And if you wanted let's say you wanted your virtual machines running on a virtual network, but you do not want them to be accessible by the public, you only want them accessible from your own company, you're going to have to set up a private network between your company and Azure. So the opposite of a VPN is the internet. So if it's not internet connected, you need it to be VPN connected. So a VPN gateway sits on both sides of this private network. You're going to need a VPN gateway for your own office and a VPN gateway running within Azure. And so VPN gateway is a service that Azure provides that allows you to have such a private connection, again, protecting your servers and services from connecting to the public internet. An application gateway might sound similar, but is essentially a more sophisticated type of load balancer. So an application gateway, whereas a load balancer is pretty much restricted to just distributing traffic that comes in evenly between 2 devices, 3 devices, 4 devices. An application gateway can actually understand the traffic. It is aware of URLs, for instance, and you can say, well, if this comes in for this URL, I want this server to handle it or this group of servers to handle it. And if the traffic comes to this URL, I want another group of servers to handle it. So in this way, you can have a load balancer that is aware of the concept of HTTP and URLs and basically distribute traffic based on ports, based on URLs, etc. Finally, the last networking concept we'll talk about is a content delivery network, or sometimes it's abbreviated as CDN. A content delivery network are servers that you don't control, but will actually store your files to distribute to your users that will basically speed up your application. The way that it works is instead of having a single server that serves every single file of your application, what you would is end up with is a distributed network of servers that can serve some of the files, the static files, the images, the JavaScripts, the CSS, videos, anything that doesn't change a CDN can help you by reducing the amount of traffic to your server, as well as delivering traffic in a lot quicker way. There's a couple of reasons why this is. One of them is the CDN network is globally distributed, whereas your server might just be running within one region. Let's say it's East US region. The CDN would have European, African, Asian servers, and that would be a lot quicker to serve traffic. The second reason is the way that your browser operates. It will know that there's multiple different URLs, different domain names, and will make requests to those servers concurrently, as opposed to queuing up this request to a single domain. So it will, at a maximum, send 6 requests to a single domain name. But if you had a CDN, that basically doubles the number of requests that go out at once. So CDN can really speed up your application. Microsoft Azure offers CDN services. The next core service we'll talk about is storage services. Now, storage is a huge part of using the cloud. A lot of companies are able to save a lot of money by storing files in the cloud and not having to worry about storing them locally, having to manage disk drives, etc. Microsoft offers an Azure storage service. When you create Azure storage, you get 4 main types of storage, the most common being blob storage. But you also can store files in a file storage or data in a columnized table or messages in a queue. These all come in an Azure storage account. Azure storage has recently expanded to be like 2 petabytes maximum for the US and Europe. And that's just a lot of storage. Petabyte storage is humongous. So Azure storage has the capability of handling every file that you would ever need it to. There is also a managed disk service. This is distinct from Azure Storage. Managed disks allow you to mount those disks essentially to virtual machines. So when you create a virtual machine, you can have a C drive and a D drive, but you can also create the E drive, the F drive, the G drive, the H drive. Depending on the type of virtual machine you get, you can create more and more of these additional disks. And Microsoft recommends you use their managed disk service to handle virtual hard disks attached to virtual machines. Finally, there is archive storage, which is basically a recovery storage account. If you're doing Azure backups, you would store those backups in a recovery services vault, and that's another type of storage that Microsoft offers. When we're talking about IT and technology, we need to talk about databases. I mean, it's very difficult to create modern applications that don't have some type of data storage. A couple of years ago, Microsoft came out with their Cosmos DB storage system. That is basically, it comes as globally available, highly responsive, super quick. It can basically respond to you in sub 10-second response times, etc. This is what they call NoSQL storage. You're not storing things in traditional SQL Server rows, columns, tables. Cosmos DB is sort of a very modern type of storage. Still, if you want to do things in relational database models, Azure has a Azure SQL database. Now, you'd still have the ability to run SQL Server in a virtual machine if that's what you wanted to. That would be under infrastructure as a service. You would be entirely responsible for running that SQL Server. You might want to consider migrating from SQL Server into Azure SQL database. That has 90% of the capabilities of a SQL Server, but it's a managed service. You're basically able to scale that much more easily. It provides you a lot of the capability. You don't have to manage the software. You don't have to manage backups, etc. Now, Microsoft SQL Server is not the only database on the planet. 2 of the most popular open source databases are MySQL and PostgreSQL. Microsoft has managed versions of these 2 databases, and they called Azure Database for MySQL and Azure Database for PostgreSQL. For instance, WordPress runs with MySQL on the back end. So if you want to run a WordPress website in Azure, you can either host the MySQL database directly within your virtual machine or your app service, or you can use a hosted database such as the Azure Database. There is also a SQL Data Warehouse, which is obviously a data warehouse is a reporting service. You know, if you got data and you're going to run like a Power BI reports on top of that, you would store your data in Data Warehouse, and that would be able to be reported on. We also have options for migration. So if you do have data stored in other services, Oracle, SQL Server, Amazon AWS, you can get data migrated into Azure a lot easier. Now, one of the first things you're going to encounter when you create an Azure account and we log into the Azure portal is what's called the Azure Marketplace. If you want to create any type of resource in a point-and-click style, then you go into the marketplace. You can choose from the categories on the left: compute, networking, storage, web. Containers is big, obviously. And you'll see lots and lots of vendors. This is where there's going to be hundreds of vendors competing to offer basically their images for you to choose. So you'll see on screen, Microsoft has a lot, but Barracuda's in there, Red Hat's in there, Citrix is in there. Different companies are offering their services to you that sometimes they even compete with Microsoft's own services. So for instance, the Barracuda service is a web application firewall, whereas Microsoft offers its application gateway that has web application firewall built into it, etc. So not all of them are Microsoft services.